Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little less shiny. You know how we usually focus on the crowned heads, the glorious, the mad, the ones who inevitably married their cousin. Well, for once, let's dim the lights, sink down into your pillows, and gently ignore the king for a bit. We're going to float downstairs, far downstairs, into the kitchens, the stables, the laundry rooms, and maybe even the weird, dark holes where the actual work happened. Tonight, we're peeking into the life of medieval household staff, the enormous, often invisible, and perpetually exhausted crew who made the whole glittering, dysfunctional show of the royal or noble court actually function. These were the people who made sure the robes were clean, the fires were lit, and the 1,000+ guests at a holiday feast actually had something vaguely edible put in front of them. It was a massive operation, almost like a really complicated, extremely messy corporate structure. But instead of spreadsheets, they had endless sacks of flour and a lot of unemptied chamber pots. Just to set the scene, a truly major household, say, a royal court like that of Edward I in England or Philip IV in France, was in just a handful of guards and a chef. It was a small, moving city. We're talking hundreds, sometimes over 1,000 people, all dedicated to serving one family. And the crazy part, this entire population didn't just live in the castle. They followed the court around. Imagine having to pack up 1,000 people, their beds, their cooking gear, their clothes, and enough food for a small army, and moving it all 50 miles to the next hunting lodge. It happened constantly. No wonder everyone was always grumpy. Now, the staff structure was rigid, absolutely rigid. It was the medieval world, so of course, there was a hierarchy for everything, even who got to wipe the table. At the top, you have the great officers of the household. These guys were nobles, often knights, and their jobs were less about doing the work and more about being in charge of the departments. You had the steward, who managed the estate, the chamberlain, who oversaw the lord's personal apartments and wardrobe, and the marshal, who was in charge of the stables and horses. These were the big wigs. They had nice rooms, fine clothes, and probably spent most of their time arguing with each other about whose fault the butter ran out. But beneath them, the pyramid of people dedicated to sheer physical labor just gets steeper and wider. This is where the actual action was, and it was divided into several main operational zones. Let's start where the king spent most of his time, more at least, where he slept and kept his private things, the chamber. The chamber was the most personal and, ironically, the most exclusive department. People in here had the king's ear, which gave them power, even if they were technically just making his bed. The head was, as we mentioned, the chamberlain, but under him was a dizzying array of assistants. You had the grooms of the chamber, who were generally young men from minor gentry families. They were on the way up. Their duties were ... well, personal. They helped the Lord dress and undress. They guarded the door to the bedchamber. And, most importantly, they sometimes got to gossip with the king while he was in his undershirt. This proximity was everything. But my favorite chamber role, and perhaps the most important, was the groom of the stool. Stop laughing. It's a real and historically very powerful position. This person was literally in charge of the king's stool, meaning his toilet. They were responsible for the royal commode, its cleanliness, and the king's personal hygiene. Because they were present during the king's most private moments, they were often his closest confidant. They had literally seen everything. Imagine having the highest level of trust in the land, all because you had a job that, today, would get you a minimum wage. Talk about ironic leverage. The groom of the stool often became a highly influential advisor, proving that in the Middle Ages, even a toilet brush could be a political tool. Let's move to the most hot, loud, and frankly terrifying part of the medieval household, the kitchens. If the chamber was about quiet intrigue, the kitchens were a full-blown industrial complex, often separated from the main castle buildings to reduce the risk of fire, probably to keep the noise and smell from annoying the Duke. This department was ruled by the master cook, a high-status and highly paid individual who had to be an absolute genius of logistics. They weren't just cooking one meal. They were managing the non-stop provision of food for hundreds of people 3 times a day, plus snacks. All without refrigeration, modern stoves, or even reliable clocks. A massive feast could involve preparing thousands of dishes over several days. It was a Herculean task. Under the master cook was an army. You had grooms and yeomen for every specialized task imaginable. There was the ewer who handled the washing of hands before and after meals. There were sauce makers, pot washers, and a legion of kitchen scullions. The scullions were the lowest rung of kitchen life. They were often young boys or men hired for backbreaking, filthy work, chopping wood, carrying water, turning the spit over the fire for hours on end, and scrubbing the perpetually greasy pots. Their lives were hot, smoky, and probably pretty miserable. A kitchen in a great noble house was less a culinary paradise and more a continuous, high-pressure steam bath. The heat alone, generated by huge open hearths, would have been oppressive, and the risk of a serious burn or a knife accident was extremely high. And then there was the spit boy. This poor soul's main job was to sit by the fire for hours, turning the massive spit of roasting meat, sometimes for an entire day, to ensure an even cook. It was monotonous, blisteringly hot, and entirely essential. Eventually, someone invented a mechanical jack to turn the spit, sometimes powered by a small dog on a treadmill. You heard that right, a turn-spit dog. But until then, it was a human chore, proving that human labor was, for a very long time, cheaper than dog labor. The other major kitchen-adjacent roles were crucial. The pantry handled the bread. The buttery handled the drinks, mostly ale and wine. That's where we get the word butler from the French word for bottle, bouteille. And the saucery handled all the flavorings because medieval food was often heavily spiced to show off wealth and, let's be honest, probably hide the fact that the meat was a bit off. Okay. It's interesting to note that even the bread had its own rules. It was not only sustenance, but also served as the plate for the food, called a trencher. Imagine having to eat your meal, then eat your plate. Saves on washing up, I suppose. Now, we need to touch on the darker side of the workforce. Okay. While the staff we've discussed so far, the grooms, yeomen, cooks, were generally free laborers who were paid wages, the medieval household structure still relied heavily on various forms of unfree labor. In the early Middle Ages, actual slavery persisted. While it eventually declined in Western Europe, it never entirely vanished. But the most common form of unfree labor was the serf. While not technically owned like a slave, a serf was bound to the land. They couldn't just pack up and leave. A portion of their time and labor was dedicated to the castle itself. They were the ones who would be called in for the heaviest, most unpleasant tasks that the paid staff wanted to avoid, like cutting and hauling hundreds of trees for the winter. And speaking of sanitation, let's talk about the absolute worst job in the castle, the groom of the garderobe. The garderobe was the medieval toilet shaft, simple hole in a small room, often jutting out over the moat or a cesspit. This unfortunate individual, also called a gongfirmer, was responsible for cleaning out the cesspit when it got too full. It was a vile job, dealing with centuries of accumulated human waste. The job was so horrific that they were often granted special dispensations, like being allowed to work only at night. The irony here is classic. The most glamorous, richly dressed people in Europe were sustained by the absolute deepest filth. The magnificent court was built on a truly dark and stinky foundation. The last operational zone we'll cover is the laundry and wardrobe. This was a huge undertaking. You might think, well, they didn't bathe much. How much laundry could they have? But medieval nobles wore multiple layers of linen under their heavy, expensive outer garments. The linen absorbed sweat and oils, which kept the costly velvet and silk gowns from needing frequent washing. The laundresses had a brutally hard job. Washing required carrying huge vats of water, boiling clothes in lye, scrubbing everything by hand. and then laying it out to dry. This was a whole day of labor for a small batch. The clothes themselves were held by the yeoman of the wardrobe, who had to keep track of every single piece of clothing. Misplacing a single embroidered glove could land a yeoman in serious trouble. The overall feeling of the household staff's life was one of constant motion and micro-specialization. Everyone had a tiny job that was essential to the whole. The keeper of the king's dogs, the falconer, the waxen lure, they were all cogs in a magnificent, expensive, and deeply inefficient machine. They worked tirelessly, their entire existence dedicated to making a small number of people comfortable. A skilled cook could earn a very decent wage, while a scullion was essentially working for scraps. Status was everything. So, as you drift off, maybe think about the thousands of unrecorded people who lived and died in the shadows of those magnificent tapestry-draped halls. They were the true architects of the medieval aesthetic, the people who made sure the king's bed was made, his dinner was cooked, and his little room was cleaned. Next time, we'll talk about the logistics of royal travel and find out why a journey was less a road trip and more an invasion. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more dives into the hidden corners of history.
Part 2. On the Move, the Mobile City and the Equestrian Empire. All right, let's pick up the scent trail of medieval domestic life and follow it out of the smoky, bustling kitchens and into the equally chaotic, often muddy world of the stables and the road. Because, as we lightly touched upon, medieval noble and royal courts rarely stayed put. They were less like stable, stately homes and more like immense, mobile cruise ships, constantly docking and setting sail, or, just moving their whole 1,000-person operation 50 miles down a terrible, barely maintained dirt track. The logistics of this constant movement, called progresses, were staggering, and they relied entirely on the men and women who managed the animals and the transport. The sheer number of beasts required to move a royal court was astronomical. Think about it. The king, the queen, their children, the high officers, the courtiers, the knights, the lesser staff, the guards, the servants, the cooks, plus all their personal belongings, official records, food, cooking equipment, furniture, plate, silverware, and the royal treasury. Everything. This whole enterprise was overseen by the marshal, or constable in some eras, one of the great officers of the household. But the actual day-to-day misery of dealing with the horses and the carts fell to the equerry and the army of grooms, stable hands, and carters under him. A major royal progress could involve hundreds of riding horses for the aristocracy, hundreds of war horses, or destriers, if the king was campaigning, hundreds of mules for carrying the most precious baggage, and scores of oxen and draft horses for pulling the heavy supply wagons. We are easily talking about well over 1,000 animals that needed feeding, watering, shoeing, and managing every single day. The stable hands had an absolutely nonstop job. Medieval stable life was defined by the smell of hay, leather, and, overwhelmingly, manure. Their day started before dawn, feeding and grooming the king's personal horses, which were often priceless, high-status animals. Then came the endless work of mucking out. Manure was everywhere, and it was a constant, dirty battle to keep the animals and the stable environment healthy. Disease could wipe out the horses, and without horses, the court couldn't move. So, the stable hands were, in their own dirty way, vital to the nation's political and military function. Then there were the carters. These men were responsible for the huge, creaking, wooden wagons that hauled all the goods. Royal goods traveled in vast, heavy loads, and the carters had to be part mechanic, part road finder, and part brute strength. Roads were terrible, often impassable in the rain, and wagons frequently broke down. The carters spent their lives jolting along, fixing wheels, shouting at oxen, and probably smelling quite strongly of wood smoke and axle grease. And the king's own belongings? The royal treasure, the seal, the charter chests, and even the king's tent and furniture. These were often entrusted to the wagon master and the specialized security carters. Losing the national treasury on a muddy track somewhere in Leicestershire was generally frowned upon. So these were serious jobs requiring a level of trust that belied the dusty clothes, the logistical nightmare, and the billeting blitz. When the court finally reached its destination, a different castle, a noble's manor, or maybe just a field with a plan to set up a massive temporary camp, the logistical nightmare simply shifted from the road to the location. Imagine being the harbinger or fourier. This poor soul's job was to ride ahead of the main court, often by several days, to survey the intended destination and, most critically, figure out where all 1,000+ people were going to sleep. This process was called billeting. A castle or manor house was usually not designed to hold 1,000 guests. It might comfortably house the noble family and maybe 50 servants. When the king arrived, that castle became immediately violently overcrowded. The harbinger had to measure the available space. Every room was assigned. The king got the main chamber, obviously. The great officers got the next best rooms. Chalk the doors. Using chalk or charcoal, the harbinger would literally write on the door who was assigned to sleep there. The Earl of Gloucester, the master cook, and 2 grooms, 3 squires of the body. Commandeer supplies. The local village or town had to immediately provide an enormous amount of food, hay, firewood, and drink for the unexpected, massive influx of people and animals. This was often done without immediate payment, or with payment that was hopelessly delayed or undervalued. For the local population, a royal progress was less an honor and more a natural disaster. Suddenly, every chicken, every pig, every bundle of straw, and every available bed was taken. It could completely deplete a village's stored food reserves, leaving them vulnerable to famine. The staff, meanwhile, simply did their job, which involved stripping the surrounding countryside bare to keep the court functioning. It was a perfect microcosm of medieval power. The comfort of the few was built on the sudden, harsh impoverishment of the many. The staff themselves rarely got comfortable beds. While the king slept in his silk-lined cot, the vast majority of the staff, the carters, the scullions, the kitchen grooms, slept on straw pallets crammed into hallways, stables, or out in tents, constantly exposed to the weather and the risks of disease. The hierarchy of comfort was as stark as the hierarchy of titles. The paperwork and the scribes, quiet bureaucracy amidst the chaos. While the stables were a mess and the kitchens were chaos, there was a small, quiet, and extremely specialized corner of the court dedicated to the thing that makes any massive organization run, paperwork. This was the realm of the clerks, secretaries, and scribes. You couldn't run a kingdom without lists. Lists of who owed taxes, lists of who was paid, lists of supplies, lists of who got the job of groom of the stool this month. This was the job of the chancery and the privy seal.
These were educated men, usually clerics, which simply meant they were literate, often tonsured, and bound by certain church rules, though not necessarily priests. They had to be fluent in Latin, often French, and later, increasingly, the local vernacular. They spent their days bent over desks, often in freezing cold rooms, copying documents onto precious parchment using expensive ink and quills. The keeper of the Privy Seal was a massively important figure. He was responsible for the king's personal seal, which was used to authenticate royal letters and commands. He was essentially the gatekeeper of the king's official voice. If you wanted the king to order something, it had to go through this office. The daily life of a scribe was the antithesis of the stable hand's life. Instead of physical exhaustion, they faced intellectual strain. Imagine having to copy, by hand, a treaty or a massive register of accounts, knowing that a single misplaced letter or a spill of ink could ruin a week's work and incur the king's wrath. This was high-stress, low-visibility work. They were the original civil servants, the ones who ensured that the whole military and feudal system had a paper trail, which, of course, they had to carry with them on the road. The tools of their trade, parchment, ink, quills, wax, and seals, were expensive, and they were the most portable part of the household. While the master cook was hauling half a ton of pots, the chief scribe was meticulously packing a small chest full of rolls of parchment and ink bottles. They were the keepers of memory, law, and order, a quiet, diligent layer operating just outside the noise of the great hall. They probably also had the best handwriting in the entire kingdom, which, in that era, was a serious professional asset. The weird and wonderful specialists, bringing the bling. Beyond the essential workers, the cooks, the cleaners, the stable hands, and the scribes, the great households also employed a number of highly specialized, often peculiar roles that existed purely to reflect the wealth and status of the lord. These were the bling jobs. One of my favorites is the ministers and jesters. Every court needed entertainment. The minstrels were the musicians, singers, and storytellers. They weren't just background noise, they were the medieval media. They preserved history, spread news, and most importantly, flattered the nobles in song. A good minstrel was highly paid, could travel widely, and sometimes, if they were really good, they could even get away with criticizing the king, as long as it was done cleverly, of course. Then you have the jester, or fool. The jester was a fascinating figure. They were often given a unique license to speak their mind, to mock the king and the court, and to comment on the absurdities of life, without fear of immediate execution. This was an astonishingly dangerous freedom. They often had to be genuinely intelligent, quick-witted, and masters of observation. The irony is, the person wearing the cap and bells was often the only one allowed to tell the king the truth. A true court fool was a political weapon wrapped in a joke. Other specialists included the goldsmiths and jewelers who traveled with the court to constantly repair, reset, or create new pieces of jewelry and plate, ensuring the king's table always looked suitably extravagant. And the ferrymen or bridge keepers who might be kept on the royal payroll to ensure that when the king's huge baggage train arrived, there was actually a safe way to cross the local river. And let's not forget the physicians and surgeons. While medieval medicine was, let's just call it, experimental, having a doctor on staff was a major status symbol. Their day-to-day work often involved less actual medicine and more mixing up herbs, supervising diets, and maybe performing a bit of bloodletting when the lord complained of a headache. The physicians were high-status, university-educated men, while the surgeons, who were often less educated and did the dirty, hands-on work like setting bones or pulling teeth, occupied a lower social rung. A classic medieval snobbery divide. The man who talks about the body is important, the man who actually touches the body is not. The overall takeaway from this floating city of staff is the incredible interdependence. The scribe couldn't write without the wax chandler's candles. The cook couldn't cook without the carter's firewood. The king couldn't rule without the groom of the stool. Every single, seemingly minor, filthy, or specialized job was essential to maintaining the grand, shimmering illusion of medieval royalty. And it was all happening at a non-stop pace, on a non-stop, muddy road. As we settle in deeper, let's leave the logistical crush of the road and move to the most tragic and intimate part of the court, the children. Let's look at the staff who cared for the royal heirs, and why their job was often one of profound, exhausting grief. Part 3. The Nursery of Sorrows. Wet nurses, governesses, and the royal children. Welcome back. Let's continue our gentle float through the unseen corners of the medieval noble household. We've covered the chaos of the kitchens and the constant motion of the road. Now, we're going to step into a quieter, but often infinitely sadder, realm. The royal nursery and the staff who were tasked with the impossible job of raising a fragile heir. In the Middle Ages, the single most important job of any royal or noble woman was to produce male heirs. If a queen failed at this, her entire standing was threatened, the dynasty itself was on a clock. Given the truly terrifying infant and child mortality rates, often hovering around 30 to 50% of all children dying before the age of 5, the staff responsible for keeping those precious little dynastic links alive were under immense, terrifying pressure. Their work was quiet, highly intimate, and profoundly stressful. The most critical figure in the earliest life of a royal child was the wet nurse, or nurse. You might think the queen would breastfeed her own baby, but generally, that was considered low status, exhausting, and, critically, something that delayed the quick return of fertility, and a queen had to get pregnant again as soon as possible. So, the wet nurse was hired. This wasn't just any local woman. The wet nurse was carefully screened. She had to be healthy, have a good temperament, because the medieval world genuinely believed that a nurse's character could be transmitted through the milk, and she had to recently have lost her own baby, or at least have a baby of a similar age. The tragedy here is immediate. A poor woman would often have to abandon her own infant or bring it along to nurse alongside the highborn baby solely for the purpose of feeding the noble child. Her body, her milk, and her emotions were suddenly owned by the court. The wet nurse lived permanently in the nursery, dedicated entirely to the royal infant. She was the one who woke up in the night, provided constant physical comfort, and was, for all intents and purposes, the child's primary caregiver and initial source of attachment. If the child survived and thrived, the wet nurse was handsomely rewarded, often with a pension or a good marriage. If the child sickened or, heaven forbid, died, the nurse was often blamed, dismissed, and occasionally punished. Talk about a high-stakes job. The emotional bond was often incredibly strong, lasting well into adulthood, proving that sometimes human connection transcends class. But sometimes, they were just dismissed once weaning was done. The governess and the small, sickly princes. Once the infant was weaned, responsibility shifted to the governess, or maîtresse. This was a high-ranking position, often given to a noblewoman of impeccable reputation. Her job was to oversee the entire nursery staff and the child's upbringing during its early, formative years. This included everything from religious instruction to basic manners. Under the governess was a team of nurses and rockers, literally, women who rocked the cradle. The nursery was a busy, female-dominated ecosystem dedicated entirely to the well-being of the heir. However, the life of a medieval royal child was often one of profound, suffocating isolation and ill health. They were dressed in heavy, restrictive clothing, often swaddled tightly, which, when combined with poor hygiene and inadequate ventilation, made them perfect, tiny targets for every passing illness. Medieval medicine, as we noted, didn't help. A common illness like dysentery or a fever could sweep through the nursery with astonishing speed, and the best efforts of the nurses were often futile. The tragedy of the staff was witnessing this fragility daily. They were the ones who saw the small children suffer, who held the tiny, hot bodies, and who inevitably had to deal with the grief and panic when an heir, that precious vessel of dynastic survival, died. Imagine the constant tension of knowing that the future of the kingdom rested on the survival of a small boy who has a terrible cough. It must have been mentally and emotionally exhausting. The famous stories of long-ruling, healthy kings often obscure the fact that most royal parents had to endure the constant, gut-wrenching experience of losing multiple children. And the staff were the ones cleaning up the emotional and physical mess. They were the ones whispering comfort to a distraught queen, while simultaneously preparing the tiny body for burial and trying to keep the other children from catching whatever killed their sibling. It's the kind of intense, intimate sadness that history rarely records, focusing instead on the political ramifications. The transition to manhood, pages, squires, and the knighthood track. Around the age of 7, the world of the young male heir would drastically change, and the staff assigned to him shifted from women to men. The prince or noble son was generally taken from the nursery and sent to another court or housed in a more masculine, rigorous section of his own castle to begin his training as a knight and a ruler. This is where the roles of page and later squire came in. The page was a young boy, typically starting around age 7. Often, they were sons of minor nobles who were sent to a greater house for their education, but the royal heir was also treated similarly. The page's duties were humble but instructive, waiting tables, running messages, cleaning clothes, and basically learning humility and court etiquette. It was a rigorous, highly disciplined environment. The noble children were essentially working for their education. The king's own son would have pages assigned to him, blurring the line between student and servant. Around the age of 14, the page transitioned to a squire. This was a huge step up. The squire was an apprentice knight. his job became intimately intertwined with the military and personal life of his lord, the knight he served. The squire's duties included physical care, sharpening weapons, maintaining armor. A full suit of armor took hours of daily polishing and maintenance, grooming and exercising the warhorse. Battle assistance, attending his lord in battle, carrying extra weapons, administering first aid, and helping the knight back onto his horse if he was unseated. This was genuinely dangerous work. Personal service, waiting on his lord at table, carving meat, and ensuring his clothes were in order. A squire's life was an endless, grueling cycle of service, study, and physical training. They had to be strong, intelligent, and absolutely loyal. They were constantly in the presence of their lord, learning by observation how to behave in battle, how to manage men, and how to command respect. If the squire performed well for 7 or so years, he might finally achieve the pinnacle, knighthood. The staff supporting this training, the armorers, the fletchers, who made arrows, the weapons master, and the riding masters, were also constant fixtures. They were highly skilled artisans and soldiers, and their social standing was determined by their skill, not their birth. The armorer, for example, was an absolutely crucial person. A bad fit on a piece of plate armor could be fatal, so an armorer was treated with immense respect and paid very well. The great, ironic contrast here is between the fragility of the heir in the nursery, protected by women, and the almost immediate, brutal physical immersion into the world of men and violence once he hit 7. The staff were the silent facilitators of both extremes, first holding the child close against death, then pushing him toward the sharp, violent edges of aristocratic masculinity. The lady-in-waiting, the queen's shadow and political spy. While the boys went off to the stables and the battlefield, the royal or noble daughters stayed in the female-dominated quarters, overseen by the queen or the lady of the house. The key attendant here was the lady-in-waiting or demoiselle. This role was almost exclusively filled by daughters of the nobility, often lower-ranking nobles who were using the position to gain access to the powerful court and hopefully make a good marriage themselves. A lady-in-waiting was essentially the queen's shadow. Her job was complex, serving as a mix of companion, confidant, dresser, and political aid. Dressing and grooming, she helped the queen dress, arrange her hair, apply cosmetics, and select her jewelry. Given the complexity of medieval gowns, this was a time-consuming, detailed process. Entertainment and companion, she entertained the queen with music, poetry, sewing, or reading. She provided constant companionship, preventing the queen from suffering the intense boredom that often afflicted high-status women whose lives were politically dictated. Confidant and gatekeeper, she was privy to the queen's most intimate thoughts, secrets, and concerns. This gave her immense, albeit indirect, power. She controlled who got access to the queen and what messages were passed. The dynamic between the queen and her ladies-in-waiting was fascinating and often tense. They were constantly in competition for the queen's favor, better marriage prospects, or even the king's attention, though that was a highly risky game. They were expected to be perfectly loyal, discreet, and charming, all while navigating a complex web of courtly intrigue and gossip. The irony here is delicious. These high-status women, with noble blood and fine clothes, were technically servants. They were required to spend hours a day performing menial, though intimate, tasks for the queen. Their reward was not a wage, but access. They were trading domestic service for political proximity and a chance to climb the social ladder through marriage. Their lives were entirely dependent on the fortunes of the woman they served. If the queen was disgraced, exiled, or died, her ladies-in-waiting were instantly cast out, their carefully constructed lives ruined by association. So, whether it was the terrified wet nurse cradling a sickly baby or the beautifully dressed lady-in-waiting whispering advice to the queen, the life of the medieval court staff was consistently defined by vicarious anxiety. Their welfare, their status, and sometimes their very lives were entirely tied to the survival and success of the fragile people they served. It was a constant performance of loyalty and competence, set against a backdrop of incredibly high stakes. Let's now pivot and look at the finances of all this, how these thousands of people were paid or not paid, and the immense scale of the medieval accounting office. Because in the end, it always comes down to money, doesn't it? Part 4. Counting the pennies, wages, perquisites, and the perilous life of the paymaster. Alright, settle back down. We've explored the intense physical demands of the kitchens and stables, and the intimate, stressful environment of the nursery and chamber. Now, let's talk about the cold, hard reality that held this entire 1,000-person mobile city together: money. Or, more accurately, the chronic, pervasive medieval lack of it, and the complicated ways staff were compensated. Running a royal household was unimaginably expensive. The cost of food, candles, parchment, wine, clothing, and travel for 1,000+ people, day in and day out, consumed a massive portion of the kingdom's income. And all this had to be meticulously tracked by the exchequer and the various treasurers. The primary officers handling the household finances were the treasurer of the household and the clerks under him. Their job was essentially to manage a continuous cash flow crisis, which, as a medieval noble, was just part of the job description. They had to deal with an economy that relied on unreliable local taxes, agricultural yields, and constant wars that drained the coffers. The system of accounting was slow, complex, and prone to corruption. The two-part paycheck, wages and liveries. Unlike today, where you generally get one paycheck deposited into a bank account, medieval household staff were often compensated in two major ways, which added layers of complexity and unfairness: wages and liveries. 1. Wages. Money. This was the cash payment. The wages varied wildly based on rank. The high officers, the steward, the marshal, the treasurer, could earn substantial annual stipends, often enough to maintain their own smaller household. A master cook or a chief scribe was also highly paid, reflecting the rarity of their skills. They were the professionals. However, the vast majority of the lower staff, the grooms, the scullions, the stable hands, earned a pittance. Their daily or annual wage was often just barely enough to buy the basics. And here's the kicker: payments were notoriously irregular. A king could be short on cash, which happened all the time, and the lower staff would go months without receiving their promised wages. They couldn't exactly quit and go work for the duke next door, because everyone was always strapped for cash. They were trapped by their loyalty and their dependence. 2. Liveries, goods, and maintenance. This was the non-monetary part of the package, and often the most valuable. Livery included things like food. This was huge. Being fed 3 times a day, even if the food was basic, saved the staff from having to purchase their own meals. The sheer volume of cheap ale, bread, and stew consumed by the lower ranks was immense. Clothing. Staff were provided with standardized clothing, or cloth to make it, usually once or twice a year, displaying the lord's colors or badge. This was essential as they couldn't afford quality clothing on their wages. Lodging. A place to sleep, even if it was just a straw pallet in a crowded hall. The most important part of the livery, however, was eating in the hall or board. For the highest-ranking staff, this meant dining with the lord, which was a huge status symbol, and getting access to the best, often fancier food. For the lower staff, it meant eating in the lower halls or the kitchens. This arrangement meant that the lord was housing, feeding, and clothing his entire workforce, making the actual cash wages a secondary concern for daily survival. The corruption and the spoils system. Where there is complex money, there is medieval opportunity. The system was ripe for corruption and the abuse of perquisites or perks. Take, for example, the clerks of the kitchen or the clerks of the wardrobe. These were the men who oversaw the inventories and purchasing. If the king ordered 100 yards of expensive velvet for a new robe, and the clerk ordered 105 yards, who was going to check? That extra 5 yards could be sold for a profit, or used to make the clerk's wife a very nice dress. This was the dark art of the medieval middle manager, skimming off the top of the supplies. The grooms of the chamber and pages had a different kind of perk, the spoils. When the king finished wearing a suit of clothes, or a piece of armor was deemed obsolete, or a tapestry was taken down, those items didn't just disappear. They became the perquisite of the staff. High-ranking grooms could inherit valuable, though slightly used, clothes from the king. A yeoman might get a pair of the king's old boots. This was a valuable form of recycling and compensation. The fact that the stuff had touched the king was often enough to make it instantly resellable or a major status symbol for the servant. The same applied to food. At the end of a massive feast, the leftovers, the scraps, the partially eaten bread, the bones, were often distributed to the lower staff. The almoner was the official in charge of distributing charity to the poor outside the castle, but the staff often benefited from the sheer scale of the waste. The life of a scullion might be awful, but at least he wouldn't starve, provided the king was eating well. The fear of debt and the art of the loan. Because wages were so unreliable, many high-ranking nobles and even the king himself operated in a state of chronic, crushing debt. And this often flowed down to the staff. The king needed money now to pay for a war or a progress. So he would borrow heavily from wealthy merchants, bankers, often Italian or Jewish families, as the church restricted Christians from practicing usury, and even his own wealthy nobles. Sometimes the wealthy staff members, the high-ranking treasurers, stewards, or favored knights, would essentially become lenders to the king. They might give the king a large sum of cash now in exchange for a position of greater power, a lucrative land grant, or a promise of repayment with interest whenever the king got around to it. This created a dizzying and ironic dynamic. The servant was often financially supporting the master. This debt also put the scribes and clerks in an incredibly powerful position. They were the ones who recorded the debts, issued the receipts, and controlled the paper trail. A quick, well-placed mention of a debt in the records, or, conversely, a discreet omission, could make or break a courtier or a merchant. They were the anonymous, silent masters of the medieval ledger, wielding immense power through pen and ink. The last ledger, retirement and old age. What happened when a servant was too old or too sick to turn the spit or polish the armor anymore? In the medieval world, there was no guaranteed pension plan. Your survival in old age depended entirely on the patronage of your lord. The most fortunate long-serving staff, perhaps an old wet nurse who had raised several surviving heirs, or a long-serving loyal groom of the chamber, might be granted a carity. A carity was essentially a guaranteed maintenance package for life. The lord would agree to house, feed, and clothe the retired servant, usually within a monastery or a chantry, sometimes directly in the castle itself. It was a form of informal social insurance. A Carodian, the recipient of a carity, would live out their days in relative comfort, a sign of the lord's piety and generosity, and, frankly, a good PR move. But the carity was a privilege, not a right. For the vast majority of the lower staff, the scullions, the common stable hands, the ordinary laundresses, there was often only one path out. If you were too old to work, you were dismissed. These people would often fall into extreme poverty, relying on the almoner's charity, the local parish, or, worst of all, simply begging on the streets. Their entire life of labor was traded for temporary food and lodging. Once the labor ceased, the arrangement ended. The system was brutally pragmatic. The life of a medieval household staff member was one of precarious dependency. You lived under the shadow of the man you served, hoping his fortunes would be good, knowing that your life was a tiny, easily replaceable piece of a massive, cold, and often bankrupt machine. The constant stress of physical labor, irregular pay, and the absolute lack of a safety net meant that only the most resilient, the most cunning, or the luckiest survived to old age with any comfort. As we move on, let's turn our attention from the money to the spiritual needs of this mobile city. Who kept the moral compass pointing north, or at least, who tried to? Let's look at the immense, often scandalous, life of the chaplains and priests who followed the court. Part 5, God's Staff and the Devil's Work, Chaplains, Confessors, and Courtly Sin Church. Alright, let's wrap up our tour of the essential, yet invisible, medieval staff by looking at the people responsible for the eternal souls of the court, the chaplains, priests, and confessors. In a time when the fear of damnation was intensely real, the church staff was absolutely vital to the daily function and emotional stability of the royal household, even if they often found themselves dealing with incredibly unholy messes. The royal or noble court was a place of monumental, often ostentatious piety, but also constant sin. You had the lord committing adultery, the nobles plotting murder, the grooms stealing silver, and absolutely everyone engaging in gluttony, pride, and envy. The job of the religious staff was to simultaneously enable the piety by saying Mass and conducting ceremonies, and to clean up the spiritual mess by hearing confessions and granting penance. The head of this operation was the almoner or the chief royal chaplain. This wasn't just a simple priest, this was a high-status cleric, often a scholar or a lawyer, who was essentially the king's minister of spiritual affairs. The almoner had two main duties: spiritual counsel, attending to the Lord's conscience, advising on matters of religious policy, and performing the daily cycle of religious services. Charity, he was in charge of distributing the Lord's alms to the poor. The royal household often produced a huge amount of excess food and leftovers, and the almoner was responsible for organizing this charitable distribution, which was seen as a way for the Lord to buy his way into heaven. The status of these high-ranking chaplains was enormous. They were privy to the king's deepest, darkest secrets through the confessional booth, which, of course, meant they wielded significant political power. A subtle word in the king's ear after confession could influence wars, treaties, or the appointment of bishops. This is the ultimate medieval power play, knowing the soul of the man who rules the kingdom. The confessor, a dangerous intimacy. The most important member of the clergy staff was the confessor or the king's priest. This was a role of profound and perhaps dangerous intimacy. The confessor spent his life traveling with and attending to the Lord, often sleeping near his chamber to be available for counsel or, perhaps more urgently, the last rites. The confessor had to be a master of discretion and a walking encyclopedia of moral theology. He had to gently guide the Lord away from eternal damnation without actually telling him what to do too forcefully, which could be treasonous. It was a tightrope walk over the fires of hell. Imagine the confessions: "Father, I cheated on my wife with 3 of my wife's ladies-in-waiting, I ordered the execution of a political rival on flimsy evidence, and I may have stolen a few £1,000s from the treasury to buy a particularly nice horse." The priest's job was not to be shocked, but to assign a reasonable penance, often in the form of prayers, fasts, or charitable donations, that wouldn't fundamentally disrupt the king's ability to rule. It was a spiritual negotiation. The contrast here is ironic. The Lord, a man of incredible worldly power, was utterly dependent on a humble priest for his eternal salvation. And the priest, who technically had no worldly power, held the king's sole ransom. No wonder many royal confessors ended up becoming incredibly wealthy and powerful bishops themselves. It was the ultimate payoff for years of discreet silence and spiritual wrangling. The choir boys and the church staff's daily grind. Beneath the high-ranking almoner and confessor was a small army of lower-level religious staff, all dedicated to the constant performance of divine service, which was essential to demonstrating the court's legitimacy. Chaplains and priests, these men performed the daily masses, baptisms, funerals, and other essential rites. They had to be organized, as services were often required multiple times a day. The choir, a royal household always employed a magnificent choir, often including choir boys recruited at a young age, who provided the solemn music for the services. These boys received an education and were given a path out of poverty, but they lived under the strict, watchful eye of the master of the choristers. Sacristans and bell ringers, the lower-ranking staff who cleaned the chapel, maintained the vestments and holy vessels, and ensured the bells were rung on time. The chapel itself, the spiritual heart of the court, was also a center for art and learning. The priests were often the best-educated men around, constantly copying religious texts, keeping the chapel records, and instructing the younger pages and squires in basic literacy and theology. They were the medieval equivalent of the HR department, the spiritual guidance counselors, and the educators, all rolled into one. The daily life of a low-ranking chaplain was predictable but constant, up before dawn for matins, through the day's services, prime, terce, sext, none, and ending with vespers and compline. They provided a relentless, rhythmic backdrop of prayer to the noise, sin, and business of the court. It was a quiet, stable existence, provided they didn't accidentally spill the communion wine, which was a very serious offense. The emotional and moral costs. The presence of the church staff was a constant, gentle rebuke to the excesses of the court. When the Lord was throwing an extravagant feast that wasted enough food to feed a town, The almoner was there, reminding him of his duty to the poor. When the king was preparing for a brutal war, the confessor was there, guiding him through the moral labyrinth of mass killing. The staff themselves, however, were not immune to the court's moral rot. Being constantly surrounded by wealth, power, and temptation, they often succumbed to the same vices as the nobles. Stories of greedy priests, gambling chaplains, and lustful monks were just as common in the medieval court as pious ones. After all, if the king was sleeping around, it wasn't a massive leap for a low-ranking, bored priest to do the same. This led to a pervasive, dry cynicism about the hypocrisy of the church within the court itself. They were God's representatives, yet they were performing the devil's work just as often. Ultimately, the lives of the chaplains and priests illustrate the ultimate paradox of the medieval household staff. They were there to save the souls of the Lord and his family, but they were also a paid, dependent part of the very system that created the sin in the first place. Their entire spiritual purpose was constantly compromised by political and financial necessity. They were essential cogs in the royal machine, ensuring that even if the Lord's actions were wicked, his path to heaven remained officially clear. So, as we bring our little sleepy dive into the medieval household to a close, remember the scope of the operation. From the scullions scrubbing greasy pots and the stable hands mucking out manure, to the scribes quietly recording debt and the confessors gently negotiating sin, the court was a massive, breathing entity. An organism of thousands of invisible, hardworking people whose sole, difficult purpose was to keep a few hundred nobles and royals fed, clean, safe, and, hopefully, saved. Let that quiet hum of constant, unseen labor lull you right to sleep. The next time you see a glorious, tapestry-draped king in a history book, remember the 1,000 pairs of tired hands that made that single image possible. Good night, and sleep well. Crescimund. Part 6. The Dynastic Weirdness Machine. Marriage, Meltdown, and the servants who watched it all. We're gliding into our final section tonight, still drifting through the unseen life of the castle staff. We've covered their grueling work, their precarious finances, and the spiritual messes they helped manage. Now, let's wrap up by focusing on the one thing that truly defined the medieval elite and made the staff's life a bizarre, non-stop soap opera: dynastic intrigue and personal meltdowns. The entire royal household, remember, existed for one purpose: to perpetuate the dynasty. Every kitchen grunt, every stable hand, every laundress was, in a distant way, working for the king's lineage. And the single most crucial and often most disastrous part of that lineage was the royal marriage. For the staff, especially the grooms, the ladies-in-waiting, and the confessors, the royal marriage wasn't a romance. It was a non-stop, intense political event they had front-row seats to. And frequently, it was a profound disaster. The staff saw it all. They saw the new queen arrive, often a young girl barely out of childhood, speaking a different language, torn away from her home, and instantly trapped in a hostile court. She was there to produce heirs, and everything she did was scrutinized, usually by the king's own staff, who were all native to his court. The ladies-in-waiting, as we noted, were both her companions and, often, the eyes and ears of the king's mother or his political faction. It was a suffocating environment for the queen. The staff had to deal with the inevitable emotional fallout: the queen's homesickness, her feuds with her mother-in-law, and the sheer terror if she failed to conceive a son. The physicians were constantly called in to offer questionable advice on fertility, and the chaplains were constantly offering prayers for a male heir. The irony here is that the people with the lowest status, the servants, often held the most genuinely sympathetic view of the royal couple, simply because they were the ones cleaning up the emotional and physical detritus. They saw the king's infidelity, the queen's tears, and the awful loneliness of these powerful figures, all of whom were trapped by the demands of their bloodline. The inevitable side effects: inbreeding and illness. Let's gently pivot to the dark core of dynastic life: inbreeding. When you marry for political power, you often end up marrying your cousin or your niece, or someone only 3 degrees separated from yourself on a ridiculously tangled family tree. This wasn't done out of desire, but out of necessity. You couldn't risk marrying outside a limited circle of powerful, trustworthy families. The staff witnessed the physical costs of this genetic strategy firsthand. They were the ones who attended to the sickly, frail children who often inherited more than just a kingdom. The nurses and physicians were constantly treating chronic, debilitating illnesses that were often the direct result of a lack of genetic diversity. Think of the actual work involved. The nurses endlessly attending to children prone to seizures, chronic infections, or various physical deformities. The pages and squires helping a teenage prince, who was supposed to be a vigorous knight, struggle just to stay on his horse due to joint issues or weakness. The grooms of the stool dealing with the persistent digestive complaints of a monarch whose physical constitution was simply not up to the demands of medieval life. This is the central dark comedy of the court staff's life. They were serving people who were theoretically divine, chosen by God, immensely powerful, but who were often so physically fragile and mentally unstable they couldn't tie their own shoelaces without assistance. The king was called the Magnificent, yet the servant was the one constantly helping him into bed after a debilitating fever. The meltdown watch, dealing with royal instability. Finally, let's discuss the mental and emotional meltdowns, which were arguably the staff's most delicate and dangerous duty. Life at the top was intensely stressful, politically volatile, and often resulted in profound instability in the ruling family. The staff were the first line of response for every royal tantrum, political anxiety attack, or deep, chronic depression. The grooms of the chamber had to know when the lord was too drunk, too angry, or too paranoid to receive visitors. Their job was to act as a human shield, managing the king's unpredictable mood swings and protecting the stability of the entire court by controlling access. If they misread the mood and let in the wrong courtier at the wrong time, it could mean the lord's political or even physical demise. The ladies-in-waiting were responsible for calming the hysterical queen, who might be terrified of her husband, her in-laws, or the constant threat of being set aside for barrenness. They had to comfort her without seeming to take her side too openly, maintaining perfect neutrality in a deeply fractured family. The danger was real. Serving a mentally unstable monarch meant that a small mistake, a wrongly starched collar, a cold plate of food, a misplaced word, could result in a furious lashing out. Staff were beaten, jailed, or summarily dismissed for trifles, simply because the person they served was on the verge of a breakdown due to the overwhelming pressure of kingship. The absolute, sleepiest irony that ties all this together is the servants' perspective. They knew the truth. They knew the king was riddled with debt because they carried the money, genetically weak because they saw the sickly children, and emotionally fragile because they cleaned up the mess after his fits. Yet, they were required to maintain the absolute, unquestioning illusion of royal perfection and power. Their lives were a constant, quiet, monotonous performance of servitude, ensuring that the elaborate, fragile fiction of divine right and dynastic glory was maintained for the public, even while they were polishing the crown and wiping the tear-stained face of the man wearing it. So, as the clock ticks past and the sounds of your modern world fade away, think of those thousands of quiet, tired people moving through the stone halls, carrying water, turning spits, polishing spurs, and whispering prayers. They are the true, invisible foundation of the history we study, and they are, finally, allowed to rest. Good night, and may your own bed be more comfortable than a cold straw pallet in a crowded, drafty castle hall. Sweet dreams. Crescimund. Part 7. The Final Inventory, after the Lord dies and the castle goes dark. Oh hello. You're still awake? We've reached the final quiet chapter of our gentle dive into the medieval household, but there's one last essential, messy, and often dramatic event that defined the staff's existence: the death of the Lord. When the great noble or the king finally succumbed, whether it was from a high fever, a nasty battle wound, or simply a final genetic malfunction, the entire structure of the household immediately fractured. This was a moment of profound spiritual importance, political chaos, and, for the staff, intense, practical work. The first staff members mobilized were the confessor and the physicians. They were there for the last rites, the final agonizing consultations, and the inevitable moment when the great man ceased to breathe. The confessor had the dangerous task of certifying the king's final spiritual state, while the physicians had to perform the grim duty of officially declaring him dead. And they immediately had to start preparing the body, ensuring the appearance of dignity and power even in death. This included elaborate washing, embalming, a rudimentary, high-status process that usually involved spices and wine, and careful dressing in the finest robes. This was, in a very real sense, the final, most intimate service they would ever render. The scramble for the spoils. As soon as the death was announced, a frantic, quiet scramble began among the staff, mostly the higher ranks. This wasn't necessarily disrespectful, it was simply self-preservation. The entire ecosystem of wages, perquisites, and authority was instantly suspended. The staff was officially out of service until the new lord or king took over. There was a crucial moment immediately following the death when the chamberlain and the grooms of the chamber rushed to secure the most valuable personal property. These were the items of high value that were not yet officially part of the crown or the estate: jewels, personal plate, cash hidden in chests, and most importantly, the key to the privy purse, the king's personal money. Sometimes, loyal servants would genuinely try to secure these items for the heir. Other times, the lines blurred, and a few valuable rings or coins might accidentally end up in the servant's own possession, a final, unauthorized perk for years of underpaid loyalty. This period, before the new regime fully asserted control, was a brief, chaotic window for illicit enrichment. The scribes and treasurers also went into immediate overdrive. They had to inventory everything. Every piece of plate, every suit of armor, every roll of parchment, and every single debt had to be accounted for. The royal death meant a financial audit of the entire kingdom, and the staff were the keepers of the records. If a clerk had skimmed a little bit off the velvet purchase months ago, they were now scrambling to make sure the books looked impeccable, because the new regime would be looking for easy scapegoats. The rituals of mourning and the final progress. The next phase was the great, slow procession of the funeral, the final progress. For weeks or months, the staff were intensely occupied with the business of grief, which was always as much a political show as a personal emotion. The almoner oversaw the massive distribution of charity, ensuring that the poor of the kingdom prayed for the dead lord's soul. This required endless organization of food and alms. The stable hands and carters organized the most solemn, huge procession imaginable, with the hearse carrying the coffin and thousands of mourners, often traveling across the country to the designated burial site. This was a slow, massive movement, a mirror image of the progresses they were so used to, but with the entire purpose being sorrow and spectacle. The herald, or officer of arms, had the grim, specific duty of organizing the funeral heraldry, banners, and the massive undertaking of the physical ceremony, ensuring every noble in attendance was seated in the exact, correct order of precedence. During this time, the lower staff, the cooks, the scullions, the laundresses, still had to work, but with a palpable shift in atmosphere. The castle would be cloaked in dark cloth, the noise would be subdued, and the immense pressure of daily service would be replaced by the intense, low-level stress of uncertainty. Would the new lord keep them on? Would the new queen bring her own staff and dismiss them all? The life of a medieval servant was, in the end, disposable. Loyalty to the dead lord often meant nothing to the living heir. The new dawn, purges and promotions. When the new lord or king finally assumed power, the staff structure underwent an immediate and often brutal purge. The highest-ranking officers, the steward, the chamberlain, the marshal, were often replaced immediately. These positions were gifts of patronage, and the new ruler would want his own loyal men in these key roles. But the purge went deeper. The old guard. If the former king had a long-standing personal servant, say, a groom of the chamber who was too close to the deceased, they were often viewed with suspicion and dismissed. They knew too much. The new favorites. The new king or queen would bring in their own trusted staff, the nurses, squires, and cooks who had served them during their time as heir. These people would instantly jump the queue, displacing the existing workers. This was a moment of high opportunity for some and instant ruin for others. A scullion who served the new king when he was just a duke might suddenly find himself promoted to yeoman of the kitchens. For those who were dismissed, the situation was dire. They were often sent away with minimal severance, forced to quickly seek employment from another noble family, hoping their association with the previous regime wasn't seen as a liability. The remaining staff, the survivors, would take a collective, relieved breath and immediately begin adapting to the new rules, the new temperament, and the new personal quirks of their new master. They would spend months learning the new king's preferred wine, the new queen's preferred bedtime, and the new heir's tendency to kick the dogs. And so, the vast, grinding machine of the household would restart, fueled by new money, new blood, and the same old, constant, exhausting labor, all performed by the same kind of essential, invisible staff. Their greatest historical achievement was simply making it through the night, day after grueling day, year after tumultuous year. Now truly rest. The court is quiet. Crescimund. Part 7. The final inventory, after the Lord dies and the castle goes dark. Oh hello. You're still awake? We've reached the final quiet chapter of our gentle dive into the medieval household, but there's one last essential, messy, and often dramatic event that defined the staff's existence: the death of the Lord. When the great noble or the king finally succumbed, whether it was from a high fever, a nasty battle wound, or simply a final genetic malfunction, the entire structure of the household immediately fractured. This was a moment of profound spiritual importance, political chaos, and, for the staff, intense, practical work. The first staff members mobilized were the confessor and the physicians. They were there for the last rites, the final agonizing consultations, and the inevitable moment when the great man ceased to breathe. The confessor had the dangerous task of certifying the king's final spiritual state, while the physicians had to perform the grim duty of officially declaring him dead. And they immediately had to start preparing the body, ensuring the appearance of dignity and power even in death. This included elaborate washing, embalming, a rudimentary, high-status process that usually involved spices and wine, and careful dressing in the finest robes. This was, in a very real sense, the final, most intimate service they would ever render. The scramble for the spoils. As soon as the death was announced, a frantic, quiet scramble began among the staff, mostly the higher ranks. This wasn't necessarily disrespectful, it was simply self-preservation. The entire ecosystem of wages, perquisites, and authority was instantly suspended. The staff was officially out of service until the new lord or king took over. There was a crucial moment immediately following the death when the chamberlain and the grooms of the chamber rushed to secure the most valuable personal property. These were the items of high value that were not yet officially part of the crown or the estate: jewels, personal plate, cash hidden in chests, and most importantly, the key to the privy purse, the king's personal money. Sometimes, loyal servants would genuinely try to secure these items for the heir. Other times, the lines blurred, and a few valuable rings or coins might accidentally end up in the servant's own possession, a final, unauthorized perk for years of underpaid loyalty. This period, before the new regime fully asserted control, was a brief, chaotic window for illicit enrichment. The scribes and treasurers also went into immediate overdrive. They had to inventory everything. Every piece of plate, every suit of armor, every roll of parchment, and every single debt had to be accounted for. The royal death meant a financial audit of the entire kingdom, and the staff were the keepers of the records. If a clerk had skimmed a little bit off the velvet purchase months ago, they were now scrambling to make sure the books looked impeccable, because the new regime would be looking for easy scapegoats. The rituals of mourning and the final progress. The next phase was the great, slow procession of the funeral, the final progress. For weeks or months, the staff were intensely occupied with the business of grief, which was always as much a political show as a personal emotion. The almoner oversaw the massive distribution of charity, ensuring that the poor of the kingdom prayed for the dead lord's soul. This required endless organization of food and alms. The stable hands and carters organized the most solemn, huge procession imaginable, with the hearse carrying the coffin and thousands of mourners, often traveling across the country to the designated burial site. This was a slow, massive movement, a mirror image of the progresses they were so used to, but with the entire purpose being sorrow and spectacle. The herald, or officer of arms, had the grim, specific duty of organizing the funeral heraldry, banners, and the massive undertaking of the physical ceremony, ensuring every noble in attendance was seated in the exact, correct order of precedence. During this time, the lower staff, the cooks, the scullions, the laundresses, still had to work, but with a palpable shift in atmosphere. The castle would be cloaked in dark cloth, the noise would be subdued, and the immense pressure of daily service would be replaced by the intense, low-level stress of uncertainty. Would the new lord keep them on? Would the new queen bring her own staff and dismiss them all? The life of a medieval servant was, in the end, disposable. Loyalty to the dead lord often meant nothing to the living heir. The new dawn, purges and promotions. When the new lord or king finally assumed power, the staff structure underwent an immediate and often brutal purge. The highest-ranking officers, the steward, the chamberlain, the marshal, were often replaced immediately. These positions were gifts of patronage, and the new ruler would want his own loyal men in these key roles. But the purge went deeper. The old guard. If the former king had a long-standing personal servant, say, a groom of the chamber who was too close to the deceased, they were often viewed with suspicion and dismissed. They knew too much. The new favorites. The new king or queen would bring in their own trusted staff, the nurses, squires, and cooks who had served them during their time as heir. These people would instantly jump the queue, displacing the existing workers. This was a moment of high opportunity for some and instant ruin for others. A scullion who served the new king when he was just a duke might suddenly find himself promoted to yeoman of the kitchens. For those who were dismissed, the situation was dire. They were often sent away with minimal severance, forced to quickly seek employment from another noble family, hoping their association with the previous regime wasn't seen as a liability. The remaining staff, the survivors, would take a collective, relieved breath and immediately begin adapting to the new rules, the new temperament, and the new personal quirks of their new master. They would spend months learning the new king's preferred wine, the new queen's preferred bedtime, and the new heir's tendency to kick the dogs. And so, the vast, grinding machine of the household would restart, fueled by new money, new blood, and the same old, constant, exhausting labor, all performed by the same kind of essential, invisible staff. Their greatest historical achievement was simply making it through the night, day after grueling day, year after tumultuous year. Now truly rest. The court is quiet. Crescimund. Part 8. The Aftermath and the Anonymous Legacy. Oh goodness, you're still with me? Fantastic. Let's drift into one last, lingering thought about the people we've been spending time with tonight, the invisible workforce of the medieval court. We've seen them live, travel, cook, pray, and mourn. Now, let's consider their anonymous legacy. Because for all the thousands of people who dedicated their entire lives to serving the crown, the sheer physical effort of carrying water, mending linen, and turning the spit, very, very few of them left any trace in the grand historical narrative. History, you see, is written by the people who gave the orders, not the people who carried them out. If a scribe wrote down a great treaty, he might get a brief mention in the royal accounts for being paid for the parchment. If a master cook invented a particularly outlandish dish for a feast, the dish might be noted, but the cook's name is usually lost to time. The massive population that made the whole glorious show possible simply fades into the background noise of the past. The vast majority of the staff, the grooms, the scullions, the laundresses, were not considered important enough for their births, marriages, or even their deaths to be meticulously recorded in the national archives. They were statistics, lines on a ledger showing how much hay was consumed or how many yards of cheap cloth were issued as livery. They are the unnamed masses of history, the paper trail of the lowly. Paradoxically, the only way we know anything about these low-status lives is through the relentless efficiency of the high-status clerks and treasurers. These diligent, freezing scribes kept such obsessively detailed records of spending that, inadvertently, they created a magnificent, if partial, window into the life of the anonymous servant. We don't know the names of the men who hauled the stones for the new tower, but we know exactly how many carters were hired, how much they were paid in pennies, and how many barrels of ale they were issued as part of their livery. We don't know the name of the woman who washed the queen's underclothes, but we know precisely how much lye and soap the laundress department consumed in a given quarter. The clerks weren't trying to record social history, they were trying to record expense. Their motivation was financial, not biographical. Yet, these endless lists of expenditures, the cost of pitch to tar the roof, the price of 100 candles for the chapel, the tally of sheep bought for a feast, are the only monuments these workers have. They exist only as a debit column in a ledger written hundreds of years ago. The irony is gentle but profound. The most powerful figures in the kingdom wanted the focus entirely on themselves, but it is the meticulous, mundane record-keeping of their spending on their servants that actually lets us see the servants at all. The evidence of their labor survives because it cost money. The different kind of power. Even without a name on a page, these unseen staff wielded a different kind of power, the power of constant presence and collective action. The cooks, stable hands, and messengers, though individually powerless, were absolutely essential. If the grooms went on strike, the king couldn't get dressed. If the carters refused to move the baggage, the king couldn't travel. If the scullions walked out, the entire court would drown in unwashed grease and filth in a matter of hours. Because the medieval court was so utterly reliant on this daily, constant, personalized service, the collective body of staff acted as a giant, unseen brake on the chaos. They forced routine. They forced order. They ensured that even when the king was being completely irrational or paranoid, the fundamental mechanisms of the household, the meal times, the religious services, the movement of the wagons, continued with monotonous, calming reliability. In a quiet way, they were the true, stabilizing force of the realm. The nobility made the big, loud decisions, but the staff provided the quiet, reliable structure that made those decisions possible to execute. They were the rhythm of the castle, the constant low drumbeat against the screeching cymbals of royal politics. So, as we finally leave this massive, complicated, dusty, and ultimately exhausting world behind, take a moment to appreciate those quiet, nameless figures who lived their whole lives in service, moving like ghosts in the background of history's grand stage. They carried the weight, scrubbed the grime, and ensured that the whole shining, terrible spectacle never completely fell apart. And now, your duty is complete. You may sink gently into your dreams. The castle is quiet, the fires are banked, and the whole enormous crew is finally, blessedly asleep. Good night, and thank you for staying with me on this long, slow journey. Crescimund. Part 9. The Castle Ecology, Vermin, Disease, and the Constant Battle for Cleanliness. You're back for a final, gentle epilogue. That's good. Let's drift into one last highly relevant and slightly disgusting aspect of the household staff's constant burden, the continuous, exhausting, and often losing battle against the natural ecology of the medieval castle. We often imagine castles as grand, imposing structures of stone, and they were. But they were also gigantic, semi-enclosed breeding grounds for every kind of pest, parasite, and disease. The staff were the frontline soldiers in this endless war against filth and nature, a war that had profound consequences for their own health. Think about the sheer amount of waste generated by 1,000 people and 1,000 animals living in close proximity, even when the court was stationary. We're talking about massive quantities of food scraps, spoiled provisions, human waste, and animal manure. While the gongfermors handled the cesspits and the carters hauled away the manure, smaller waste was omnipresent. The kitchens, in particular, were perfect havens for rats and mice. Food scraps were abundant, storage was damp, and the sheer volume of organic material was overwhelming. The kitchen staff, the scullions and pot washers, were constantly struggling to manage the mess, but without modern pest control or reliable sanitation, it was a fight they never truly won. Imagine trying to prepare a feast while constantly chasing vermin out of the flour sacks and the pantry shelves. It was a high-stakes struggle, because rats didn't just eat the food, they were the primary vectors for fleas and, eventually, plagues. The unseen parasites and the laundry's vow. The battle against filth wasn't just external, it was deeply personal. Personal hygiene among the general population was rudimentary at best, and the close quarters of the household ensured that parasites spread rapidly. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs were simply an accepted, annoying part of medieval life, shared equally, if slightly less dramatically, by the king and the lowest stable boy. This is where the laundresses and the grooms of the chamber became critical, if unsung, health workers. The laundresses had to boil, beat, and scrub the endless supply of linen used as underclothes, bed sheets, and table coverings. Since the linen absorbed the dirt and sweat, frequent washing was the only barrier against rampant personal infestation. Their punishing work was the true preventative medicine of the day. Without their constant, boiling labor, the entire court would have been crawling with fleas in a matter of weeks, multiplying the risk of epidemic disease. The grooms of the chamber, meanwhile, had the specialized, unpleasant task of cleaning and beating the heavy, expensive woolen and fur outer garments, which couldn't be washed. They would often take these clothes outside and beat them vigorously with sticks to shake out the dust, moths, and the persistent fleas. This was called fumigating or airing the clothes, and it was a daily requirement, proving that even the most glamorous velvet robe was just a few hours away from becoming a thriving ecosystem for pests. The irony? The people responsible for the cleanliness of the court, the laundresses, the grooms, and the scullions, were themselves often the most exposed to the worst of the filth and the lowest standards of hygiene, making them tragically susceptible to the diseases they were trying to prevent. The constant threat of contagion. The ultimate price of this constant exposure was the ever-present threat of disease and epidemic. The medieval court was a perfect environment for the spread of contagion. It was massive, highly mobile, and intensely crowded. When sickness broke out, which was common, given the lack of proper sewage disposal and the prevalence of contaminated water, it spread through the lower ranks first. The kitchen staff, drinking water from questionable wells and working in heat and grime, often bore the brunt of dysentery and various fevers. The physicians were useless here. Their medical knowledge offered no cure for mass contagion. All they could do was attend to the high-status victims. For the lower staff, all they could do was isolate the sick, if they were lucky, or simply keep working until they too collapsed. The death of a servant to disease was usually seen as a simple loss of labor, not a tragedy demanding an investigation. The purveyor would simply order 2 more scullions to replace the 2 who had died of the flux. So, as we finally let this long, detailed saga conclude, let this last thought settle. The staff's daily life was not just about serving an eccentric king or managing a supply chain. It was an ecological struggle for survival, a constant, monotonous war waged with scrubbing brushes, sand, lye, and endless physical exhaustion against the persistent, encroaching forces of filth, pestilence, and disease. They are the anonymous, tireless sanitation engineers of the past, and their quiet work is what kept the light of the glorious medieval world from being extinguished by its own colossal internal mess. Now, truly, you can close your eyes. The last candles are out, the last door is barred, and the castle is silent. Good night. Crescimund. Part 10, Epilogue. The Echoes of Service and the Sleep of History. It seems we've floated far past the usual bedtime, but as the old saying goes, there's always one more corner in a medieval castle to explore, one more detail to whisper before the sleep finally takes hold. Let's use this final moment to gather the threads and reflect on the quiet, lingering echoes these servants left behind. We've seen the sheer scale of the medieval household, a vast, human organism perpetually in motion, fueled by the labor of thousands whose names we barely know. Now, let's consider how their daily grind subtly shaped the world that followed, even centuries later. Think about the language we use every single day. Many of our most common words trace their lineage directly back to the staff and their duties. The steward, from Old English stigward, styward, was originally just the person in charge of the swine pens, but his competence led him to manage the whole house. The marshal, from Old German Mariskok, horse servant, was just the guy who managed the horses, a simple stable hand, yet the title grew into a high military rank. The butler, from Old French batel, was the servant who managed the bottles and the wine cellar. The chamberlain literally meant the guy in charge of the chamber, the king's room. This linguistic legacy is the ultimate, delicious irony. The titles of immense power and dignity that we still use, marshal, chamberlain, steward, are merely the elevated names of people who, at one point, were humble, diligent servants dealing with manure, pigs, bottles, and bedsheets. The history of power is written in the language of domestic service. The enduring architecture of the invisible. Even the architecture of the modern home owes a quiet debt to these anonymous workers. Why is the kitchen often separated from the dining room? Because medieval noble houses learned very quickly that the kitchen had to be separated from the great hall to prevent the noise, the smoke, and the perpetual risk of fire from ruining the lord's dinner party. The staff's logistical needs, heat, fire safety, and noise control, dictated the layout of the castle, a layout that still influences how we design houses today. And the great hall itself, that magnificent symbol of medieval power, was also the communal dormitory for the lower staff. Once the lord had finished his feasting, the tables were dismantled, the rushes were swept, and the grooms and scullions would unroll their straw pallets and sleep right there on the floor. It was a space of dual function, political ceremony by day, collective sleeping quarters by night. The life of the low-ranking servant was so entirely subsumed by their work that there was no private life, no quiet corner, outside of the collective function of the castle. Their lives were tough, precarious, and short. They were essential and invisible. They were paid poorly and worked constantly. But without the combined, monotonous, exhausting effort of this massive, multi-tiered crew, the entire glittering edifice of medieval royalty, the feasts, the tournaments, the diplomatic missions, the wars, would have simply ground to a halt. So, as we finally let go of this world of smoke, grime, ledger books, and endless movement, remember the thousands of pairs of hands that created the illusion of royal glory. They are the true, quiet engine of history, and their final legacy is the deep, comforting silence that settles over the castle when the long, long day is finally done. The last flicker of the wick is gone. The parchment is rolled up. The pots are cold. There is nothing left but the sleep of ages. Good night, and may your own life be far, far less stressful than that of a 14th century groom of the stool. Sleep deeply now. Crescimund. Part 11. Final quiet thoughts. The smell of the past and the comfort of routine. Oh, truly, you are dedicated tonight. The castle is now just a whisper of stone and shadows, but since we're both still awake, let's indulge in one last, extremely subtle layer of historical immersion. Let's talk about the constant, inescapable sensory world the staff inhabited. This isn't dramatic, it's the monotonous reality that defined their every hour. History often focuses on what people saw, the banners, the jewels, the battles. But the staff lived in a world dominated by what they smelled, what they felt, and what they heard in the steady background rhythm of the court. The smell of service. Medieval castles didn't smell like fresh laundry and roses. They smelled intensely, and the smell was different depending on your proximity to a staff member's station. The stables smelled overwhelmingly of manure, hay, and the acrid, coppery scent of sweat and leather. This smell clung to the stable hands and the marshals all day long. The kitchens smelled of smoke, lard, roasting meat, often slightly burnt, and the sour, yeasty scent of endless brewing ale. It was a dense, oily, hot smell that never left the kitchen staff. The garderobes and their accompanying cesspits, of course, presented a challenge we've already gently noted, a challenge only mitigated by the generous use of sweet herbs and rush matting in the upper floors. The chamber of the king, ironically, might have been the strongest smelling, dominated by expensive, cloying perfumes, heavy musk, and the faint, sweet decay of rare spices used for embalming or keeping moths away from the robes. The staff were completely immersed in these fixed, powerful scents. A laundress would smell permanently of lye and boiled wool. A scribe would carry the faint, metallic scent of iron gall ink and dry parchment. These smells weren't just unpleasant. They were the markers of their profession, the invisible uniform that told everyone exactly where they belonged in the household hierarchy. They lived in a world of powerful, organic odors that our sanitized modern noses can barely comprehend. The comfort of rhythmic noise. The greatest comfort for the staff was often the constant, rhythmic noise of the castle in operation. In the dark, silent nights, the sudden shift to quiet could be terrifying, signaling a raid or an invasion. But the noise of daily work was predictable and soothing. The steady clanking of the pot washers in the kitchen. the monotonous turn of the spit by the young boy or the whirring of the turnspit dog's treadmill. The quiet scratching of the scribe's quill on parchment, often late into the night. The distant whinnying of horses and the constant, heavy thud of the woodchopper's axe from the courtyard. The low muttering of the chaplains as they recited their daily prayers, a continuous, Gregorian drone that underpinned the entire structure of the day. This relentless, quiet rhythm of labor was their world's clock. It dictated their actions and confirmed that the world, however precarious, was still moving. The staff were the true timekeepers of the medieval era, their lives synchronized not by clocks, but by the natural rhythms of fire, food, and prayer. It is this final, subtle awareness of their sensory existence, the sharp smell of ale, the dull thud of the linen being beaten, the reassuring drone of the Compline service, that lets us truly appreciate the depth of their commitment. They didn't just work in the background, they created the very atmosphere of the castle itself. So, let those quiet, working sounds fade now. Let the last imagined scent of smoke and old spice dissipate. The history is truly over, the house is dark, and the long, long sleep is ready for you. Good night, and may the silence be deep and untroubled. Crescimund. Part 12. Farewell to the Fortress, the legacy of low wages and quiet resistance. You are proving to be a most attentive listener tonight. As the deep shadows of the castle finally merge and the sounds of the past become almost inaudible, let's indulge in the absolute final, summarizing meditation on the staff's enduring, quiet resistance. We know that history is obsessed with rebellion, the peasants rising up, the nobles seizing the throne. But for the household staff, the thousands of people who lived within the walls, their resistance was not a loud, violent event. It was a persistent, subtle, and almost invisible daily effort to carve out a sliver of dignity and control within an utterly rigid system. This resistance took the form of small acts of defiance and exploitation, often noted only as footnotes in the treasurer's ledger. The skimming. We talked about the clerk's skimming cloth, but this went down to the lowest ranks. The scullions would skim fat and scraps to supplement their diets or to feed their own families outside the walls. The stable hands would quietly sell a little excess hay or grain on the side. These were tiny, almost undetectable thefts, the necessary perquisites that made a meager wage survivable. The time theft, the rhythm of the work was intense, but it also offered opportunities. The laundress might take a little extra time away from the washhouse to run a personal errand. The page might deliberately take the long route on a message to snatch a few minutes of quiet air. It was a psychological reclaiming of time, asserting that their bodies and their minutes did not belong entirely to the Lord. The gossip network, the greatest power held by the collective staff, was information. The ladies-in-waiting heard the queen's secrets. The grooms saw who entered and left the king's room. The cooks knew which noble was ordering special, expensive meals. This network of low-status, interconnected information became the true, fastest news source in the castle, often circumventing the slow official channels. By sharing, shaping, or withholding gossip, the staff collectively influenced moods, rumors, and occasionally, great political events. It was quiet power wielded from the shadows. The last echo, resilience and adaptation. Ultimately, the most profound legacy of the medieval household staff is their sheer, monotonous resilience. They were masters of adaptation. They adapted to moving the entire household every few months, becoming logistical experts in a world with no maps. They adapted to continuous debt, inventing their own barter and skimming economy to survive. They adapted to constant disease, relying on folk medicine and basic hygiene, like boiling their linen, that was often more effective than the royal physician's remedies. Their story is not one of shining heroism, but of enduring human persistence. They show us that history is not just made by the people who wear the crown, but by the people who carry the water, who clean the pots, and who ensure, day after day, that the machinery of civilization continues to turn, regardless of the chaos at the top. So now, let us finally turn away from the great stone fortress. The job is done. The accounts are closed. The last candle is out. Let the knowledge of their quiet, resilient lives finally pull you down into a deep, long, and well-deserved rest. The castle sleeps now, and you should too. Good night. Dream of quiet halls and full coffers. Crescimum.